All right, hi class. This is lecture 5A, notes. We're going to go through, and I would love if you could make sure that you're filling in your version of the notes, as well as responding to the lecture questions that I ask along the way and at the end of the lecture. We're going to start off with a little bit of review. First with this idea of what is homeostasis, right? So I actually want you to write this down. This is your first question. What is homeostasis? Remember, it's a maintenance of a stable internal environment. And then think about how our skin is involved in regulating homeostasis. How does our skin contribute to different feedback mechanisms involved in keeping our body maintained at a stable internal environment? Again, you're writing this down as your first response lecture question. And if you need extra time, feel free to pause, but I'm going to keep going. So when we talk about the skin, another name for the skin is what we call the integument. And it consists of three major regions. You saw these regions in your intro to skin that you worked on after the test. But we have the superficial. Remember, superficial means closest to the surface. That is the epidermis. We have the middle region, which is the dermis. And we have what we call the hypodermis, which is the deepest region, or lowest down from the surface. This is also what we call our subcutaneous level. Subcutaneous layer. And remember that cutaneous membrane means skin. So subcutaneous means below. And this is composed of mostly adipose tissue, which you know from last unit is our fat cells. Here's a nice model of the skin. You will see this picture time and time again this unit. Familiarize yourselves with it and use it to help you with that skin introduction that you worked on last class as well. So talking about the epidermis, remember that the epidermis is the most superficial layer. This is what we call keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So you know that stratified squamous epithelium is multiple layers of flattened cells. Keratinized means that they have developed a protein keratin inside of them that causes their cell membrane to harden. And this contributes to their function of protection. Think about the top layer of our skin. It's protecting us from any foreign invaders. It's allowing even for a little bit of waterproof resistance from water dripping on our skin. And that is caused by the keratinization. You may have heard of the protein keratin when you hear about like nail or hair treatments as well. And that's what gives nails especially and hair their kind of rigid structure. That protein is very tough. So in the epidermis, we have keratinocytes and melanocytes. Remember that cyte means a mature cell. So the keratinocytes, if you couldn't have guessed, produce that protein keratin. And melanocytes actually produce a pigment that we call melanin. So you may have also heard of this before as well, but melanin is the pigment in our skin that gives us its color. So those people that produce less melanin have lighter skin. Those people that produce more melanin have darker skin. We also have epidermal dendritic cells. We also call these cells Langerhans cells. That's the scientist who discovered them. And these are macrophages that help activate an immune response when our skin is invaded, basically like when we have a wound or a tissue wound in that epidermal layer. These cells help trigger a response from the immune system, sending other macrophage-like cells to clean up debris and white blood cells in an immune response. Lastly, we have what we call tactile cells. These are also called Merkel cells. Again, the scientist who named them, lucky gent. And these are touch receptors that help us in our skin feel pressure or touch. If you look at this picture, we're about to go through the layers of the epidermis. There are actually 5 layers of the epidermis. Here you see 4. I'll explain why only 4 are pictured here in a second, but start to familiarize with these 4. Remember that at the top, this is the most superficial layer of the epidermis. So the stratum corneum is the uppermost layer of the epidermis, the layer that you could physically touch right now on your skin. Whereas the stratum basal is the deepest epidermal layer. So that remember right now, all we're talking about is the epidermis, the top layer of the skin itself. So in looking at the epidermis, we're going to start at that bottom layer or basal layer. How I remember it is basal or bottom. We learned that last unit as well in our tissue unit. Like I mentioned, this is the deepest epidermal layer. It's attached to the dermis. So the dermis is the second layer. So this deepest layer is attached to the dermis. It's one row of stem cells. From prior knowledge, you probably know what stem cells are, but just in case, stem cells are undifferentiated cells in our body that will eventually differentiate or specialize to a specific function. So these stem cells in our stratum basal layer are eventually going to become stratified squamous epithelium as they move up our skin. So think about, we've talked about this statistic before, but 80% of the dust in your house is skin. Dead skin cells that have sloughed off of your skin. So think about, you're constantly regenerating that upper layer, that epidermal layer of skin, constantly, every day, and that's arising from this stratum basal or bottom, deepest layer of the epidermis, made up of these stem cells. These cells undergo rapid division, like I just mentioned, and it takes them about 25 to 45 days to get from that bottom layer and move up to the uppermost surface layer of the epidermis and eventually be sloughed off and end up as dust in your living room or in my classroom. Second layer is the stratum spinosum. So this is right above the stratum basal. These cells contain a web-like system of intermediate prekeratin filaments. So these prekeratin filaments are what are going to eventually become those keratin proteins that we mentioned that cause the cells to harden. So picture this as like a cell's journey from the deepest layer of the epidermis to the uppermost layer of the epidermis as it's differentiating from a stem cell, becoming keratinized, hardening, and then dying and sloughing off of your skin. These stratum spinosum cells also have melanin granules, which are, remember, the pigment that give us our skin tone, our skin color, and dendritic cells that have a lot to do with reception, touch reception, and pressure reception, as well. Next layer is what we call the stratum granulosum. This is a very thin layer, only 3 to 5 cell layers thick, and this is where the cells start to flatten out. So they're becoming that squamous shape that we talked about last unit. And then this is where keratin, granules, and other lamellated granules. Remember that granules are just tiny particles within a cell that are eventually going to either function in becoming a protein for the cell, giving the cell the striated appearance we often see. So these, most important thing to remember is that keratin is accumulating and eventually going to cause the cell to harden. This is where that layer that I mentioned that wasn't mentioned in that overall slide, the kind of fifth invisible layer we call it, or clear layer, comes into play, and this is what we call the stratum lucidum. How I remember it, and you're going to make fun of me, but stratum lucidum sounds to me like a Harry Potter spell, and it's an invisible layer of skin, so it helps me remember the stratum lucidum, if that'll help you, is the invisible layer of our skin. And we call it invisible because it's only found in areas of our body that are made up of what we call thick skin. So for example, like our thighs, our inner thighs, our hip regions, around our arms, this is where we have thick skin. So this fifth layer will be present in those areas. Other areas like our face, eyelids, hands won't have necessarily this clear layer. And again, this is a very thin layer, and it has those dead keratinite cells. Those are going to start to form here, offering just a little extra cushion to that epidermis. Last but certainly not least is the uppermost layer, which is what we call the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is 20 to 30 rows of just dead, flattened, keratinized membranous sacs. So these are actually no longer even cells. They're technically dead by the time they get to this layer. They function in protecting us from abrasion and penetration, like I mentioned before. They're waterproof. They're a barrier against any biological, chemical, or physical assaults entering or at risk of entering our body. And they also make up 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. So this is making up a huge portion of the epidermis. And remember, these are those cells that are sloughing off or coming off when you are losing skin cells. Again, this shows you those layers from deepest, gives you a nice summary, to most superficial. Remember that in thick skin, we see in between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum, that invisible layer, the stratum, or clear layer, the stratum lucidum. Now moving down or deeper into the layers of the skin, we come to our second layer, which is known as the dermis. So the dermis is made up of connective tissue. We talked about this a little bit in our tissue unit as well. The cells include fibroblasts. Remember that suffix blast means a young, immature cell, creating collagenous or elastic or reticular fibers for the cell that contribute to the tensile strength and elasticity of that tissue. We have macrophages, which are cells that are going to engulf or phagocytize debris or broken cells in the cell, and occasionally mast cells and white blood cells that contribute again to that immune response. And we have two layers, a little easier this time, two layers of our dermis, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So if you notice here in our picture, we're going to talk right now about the dermis. You see that the papillary layer is this tiny layer right below the epidermis, and the reticular layer makes up most of the thickness of the dermis. This is where we'll see our hair follicles, veins, nerve endings, sweat glands, oil glands embedded within this layer. So the papillary layer, remember this is the layer closest to that stratum basal of the epithelium, that lower or deepest layer of the epithelium. Epidermis. This is made of areolar connective tissue. Now remember we talked about that last unit as well. Lining all epithelial tissues is areolar connective tissue, so it makes sense that this is the uppermost layer of the dermis. Has those collagen and elastic fibers we talked about that contribute to elasticity, tensile strength, the ability basically for our skin to stretch and recoil, and has some blood vessels in there. The dermal papillae contain capillary loops, which are basically a fancy name for tiny, tiny, tiny blood vessels that are carrying blood to that area. Meissner's corpuscles, which is a very, very funny name and fancy name, again, a scientist, who discovered these are touch or pressure receptors as well in our arm. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. And free nerve endings. Free nerve endings are going to contribute to things like temperature and pain in our skin. Following the papillary layer, we have the reticular layer. This is 80% of the thickness of the dermis, so making up most of that dermal layer. Has collagen fibers, again, to provide strength and resiliency, and elastic fibers to provide that stretch and recoil properties. So if you even pull on your arm skin, you can see that if you pull your skin, it'll snap right back into place. We know that as we age, that ability to snap right back into place or recoil right back into place starts to lessen or weaken, and that is why people get wrinkles or saggy skin as they age. Okay, in our skin, we have friction ridges. Basically, this is a fancy name for our fingerprints, so you can actually look at your skin and see these friction ridges. Remember that everyone's fingerprints are unique. We are actually going to do a lab next week on fingerprints, a nice little CSI crime investigation lab where we'll take our own fingerprints, try and find the culprit in the classroom. It'll be really fun. This shows you a picture of your fingerprint, and you can look at your own as well. But notice how there are tiny glands within those friction ridges, and that's what allows our skin to maintain its oily texture and allows for sweat to be released from that area. So your hands, you probably know from experience, release a lot of sweat and oil, which is why when things like nervous or hot, you'll release and get very sweaty on your hands and your feet in particular. Okay, other markings in your skin are what we call cleavage lines, and these lines actually run parallel to the collagen fibers within our dermal layer of our skin. So this is a little fun fact for you. If you, when doctors are making incisions on a patient, so say they're having a surgery and you're taking out the patient's appendix, they're going to actually make the incision along those cleavage lines so that they will heal back quicker, as opposed to perpendicular to those cleavage lines in which you would cut fibers in half and it would be harder to heal, because as we know, connective tissue is not as easily regenerated as epithelial tissue is. This shows you those cleavage lines on our body, again, as an FYI. But this is a very common trend, especially in surgery, to cut along those cleavage lines, which is just pretty interesting. Next, we're going to talk about skin color. So I mentioned those melanocytes, or those melanin-producing cells. We actually have three pigments within our body that contribute to skin color. The first of which is melanin. It gives us that yellow to reddish brown, or what we call black color or pigment in our skin. So again, production of melanocytes has an evolutionary history. People who lived closer to the equator and therefore sun exposure produced more melanin to protect them from the sun. On the other hand, people who lived further away from the equator and therefore sun exposure and UV rays produce less melanin because evolutionarily they didn't need it to protect their skin from those harsh UV rays. This pigment melanin is produced by melanocytes, migrates to those keratinocytes, remember those mature keratinized cells, where they form pigment shields and protect the cell's nuclei, which stores its DNA, from UV radiation. Freckles and other moles in our body, as we probably can now tell, are accumulations or clusters of melanin pigment. So any freckle you might have or mole you might have is a localized accumulation of that melanin pigment. Second pigment in our skin that contributes to color is the pigment keratin. This gives us that yellow to orange color, and some of you may have already noticed this about yourself, but it's most commonly found on our hands and the soles of our feet, which is why some people have a yellowish or orangish hue to their palms or the soles of their feet. Third and final pigment that contributes to our skin color is hemoglobin, and this is responsible for the pinkish hue of our skin. Hemoglobin tends to accumulate, funny enough, in our cheeks and on our face, so that's why your face will get red or you will blush when you're nervous, things like that, because that hemoglobin pigment is coming out in those areas. Some derivatives, or what we call appendages of the skin, so these are structures that are embedded within the skin that contribute to the skin's function, are sweat glands, oil glands, hair and hair follicles, and nails. We're going to talk about a few of these now. We'll talk a few of them during 5B. So we have two main types of sweat glands. Fancy name for sweat glands are sudoriferous glands. Say that with me, sudoriferous. The first type of sweat gland are what we call eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. Remember that term merocrine from last unit. We talked about how this exocrine gland releases its product by exocytosis. Merocrine glands are specific to sweat, are called eccrine glands, and they're most abundant on our palms, soles of our feet, and on our forehead. This probably makes a lot of sense to you because those are the three most common areas of producing sweat. Remember that sweat is 99% water, so mostly water, some salt, includes some vitamin C, some antibodies that our body is producing, dermcidin, which is basically a protein found in your sweat glands, and then other metabolic waste. So remember that sweat is also a mechanism to get rid of waste, in addition to a mechanism, a feedback mechanism of homeostasis to cool us down. These ducts connect to pores in our skin. That's how we release the sweat itself. And main function is to help in thermoregulation, which is, again, that answer to the first question at the very start of our lecture as to how the skin is helping us in that homeostatic maintenance. Here you can see the sweat pore, and if you look down, you see that eccrine sweat gland. Eccrine sweat gland. So this is our focus here. Second type of sweat gland are what we call apocrine sweat glands, and these are found in our armpits or axillary and our genital areas. So this is like technically a different kind of sweat, and lucky enough for you, you are in the height of your apocrine gland production because you're going all through puberty as high schoolers and adolescents. Lucky you are producing sebum. Sebum is a combination of sweat and other fatty substances or fatty proteins that are produced in those what we call reproductive areas. So think also about production of pubic hair, and hair in your armpits happens at puberty. This is also going to stimulate production of these apocrine sweat glands, or stimulation rather of these apocrine sweat glands. We have specialized apocrine glands that we find in our ear. So as you know, our ears produce earwax. This is actually a specialized version of those apocrine sweat glands, and in our mammary glands, more commonly in females, and again stimulated during puberty and when the female is pregnant. Okay, second type of gland are oil glands. Fancy word for oil glands are sebaceous glands. These are widely distributed throughout our skin, and most of them are developing near our hair follicles, which is why when we think about like our hair getting oily or greasy, is because those oil glands are typically connected to the hair follicle itself. So the oil is actually being released through the hair follicle along the shaft of the hair. Again, these also become active at puberty. and produce that sebum substance as well. The sebum is released through holocrine secretion, if you remember that from last unit. That's where the cell ruptures to release its products. They are bactericidal, meaning that they're going to help prevent prevent bacteria from entering your skin. And it helps soften our hair and skin, which is why oil production is good for us homeostatically. If you look here, you see that sebaceous gland is attached to the hair follicle itself, so that sebaceous gland is actually going to release oil through the hair follicle. Okay, and that brings us to the end of 5A. Here are your 4 questions in addition to that first one I asked at the very beginning. So you should have a total of 5 questions for me to check when I am back. You can read the questions here, and again, go back and listen to any of these parts or look back at your notes if you're not sure about how to answer any of these questions. Thanks for listening, thinking about you all while I'm on my vacation, and I will see you soon. See you next week. All right.